Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, 3 weeks on and the 24 Ukrainian sailors that the Russian Coastguard illegally captured in late November remain behind bars. Now, a group of 34 lawyers are joining forces to secure the release of the prisoners of war. They will meet with the Ukrainian sailors before the end of the year. So what else can Ukraine and the international community do? Now, to tell us more about this, I'm pleased to say we're joined in the studio today by Tsymbrivsky. He's the head of USAID Human Rights in Action program. Hello, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'd like to talk to you about the status or how they're being treated, whether it's prisoners of war, but also whether it could be civilians they're treated as in prison. But before we get to that, I'd like to play you a soundbite from earlier on in the week from Ukraine's human rights representative Lyudmila Denisova and Nikolai Polozov. Let's have a listen.
Зараз наші адвокати.
As of now, our lawyers have managed to meet with 11 out of the 24 political prisoners. Not because they don't want to or cannot, but because they weren't allowed to. Because investigation has started for 8 of them and 3 are wounded.
У этих моряков есть все шансы.
The sailors have a chance to be released thanks to the political decision which the Kremlin will inevitably adopt. Holding 24 political prisoners is very expensive, especially considering the position of the civilized world and Ukraine.
Yes, that was Mr. Polozov talking about the position, and we can talk about that a bit later. But I think first, it'd be interesting to get your views about the differences between how prisoners of war can be tried, because under the Geneva Convention, there's very limited maneuverability there, whereas if you're seen as an ordinary citizen, there's a greater scope. Is that right? Can you explain this difference?
Yeah, sure. First of all, let me give you a broader context in order to address this issue. Foremost, we should be aware that the recent incident in the Sea of Azov is a part of the ongoing aggression from the Russian Federation against the Ukraine, which is taking place starting from 2014, actually no later than 26th of February, as it was established in 3 of the releases of the prosecutor office.
Well, this was the invasion of Crimea.
Yes,
that's when it started.
Yes,
yeah.
This is the date which was actually established the effective control over the peninsula on behalf of the Russian Federation. And this is very important in order to assess the situation. That means that from the standpoint of international law, international humanitarian law is relevant, since we are talking about the international armed conflict, which is the term which is used by the 4 Geneva Conventions. Actually, the 3rd article, which is common to these Geneva Conventions, says that this is the armed conflict taking place between 2 states. Nonetheless, that one of them might not declare a state of war, the other is neglecting state of war. So this is a matter of fact, first of all. And this is supported also by the practice of international tribunals and courts, namely the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the Tadic case. They established that the same assessment of the international armed conflict.
Because actually this is very interesting. Russia has captured these Ukrainian sailors, so if they are treated as prisoners of war, then I guess you could say that Russia is almost admitting, confessing a war that is always denied.
Very accurate observance from your side, of course, that it would be disregarding all the narrative which was being built up by the Russian Federation. It was neglecting the fact of occupation, of annexation, and using force in order to take control over the Crimea, but still it is in contradiction with a numerous assessment on the side of the international organizations. General Assembly has adopted so far 4 resolutions, and they have a common ground in assessing this situation, that is the ongoing occupation, and that the international humanitarian law is relevant to this issue.
So tell me about the difference then between sort of prisoners of war and civilians. How is it that they're different with regards to the Geneva Convention, for example?
In terms of Geneva Conventions, specifically the 3rd Geneva Conventions, it tackles the issues on the prisoners of war. It states that the prisoners of war are those people who are combatants, and in terms of their capture, they should be granted the status of prisoners of war, and they should not be treated as civilians.
So how does this affect their jail time, their treatment? What is the difference?
So the principal difference here is that they have the right for principally different treatment in comparison to other people who might be captured by Russian Federation within the armed conflict. And this means, as it is stipulated by the Third Geneva Convention, that they should be kept in isolated places, not in the jails as the ordinary people. They should not be separated. They should be treated humanely. They should have the right to fair trial, which is very important point and issue. And in this regard, I should mention that the Prosecutor Office of the Autonomous Republic of the Crimea, they started the Crimean investigation in this issue on account of breaching the Article 438 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, linking it to the violation of the right to fair trial, which is enshrined in the Third Geneva Convention.
So there's a lot of conventions and a lot of standards which Russia is not following. For example, the lawyers did say on Monday that a lot of the prisoners are actually separated at the moment, which would be contrary, if that's true, to the Geneva Convention. So what sort of strategy then do the lawyers have, this group of 34 lawyers?
You are quite right in your observation here, since Russian Federation is continually and systematically violating international law, and the principal obligation from the civil society, from international organizations and Ukraine itself is to document these violations and to pass to the authoritative international institutions or tackle these issues on the national level. So this is the main strategy, to get access to our prisoners of war.
So really it's only through diplomatic channels. This is one of the main tools in the toolbox, you would say?
There is no one clear-cut answer to this issue, since we should address this issue in numerous ways, taking into account legislative approaches, diplomatic, political. So solely by virtue of invoking legal proceedings, it's not enough. For example, we should also prevent those violations on the side of Russian Federation through imposing targeted sanctions against such people who are perpetrators, who are falsifying these criminal proceedings, and etc. Also, we should invoke different international organizations. For example, we see some success on the side of Ukraine when the recent resolution on the militarization of the Crimea has been adopted on the General Assembly. Also the resolution on the side of European Union.
How much of an effect do you think that these resolutions have? Because I'm pretty sure that since the war started there have been a lot of resolutions that have been passed. So what sort of impact do they have?
They do not have instant impact. They have very scarce impact.
So it's like a long-term thing.
But in the long term, in the perspective of the judicial proceedings which would take place, it is extremely important. For example, we could take into account the proceedings which are taking place in the International Court of Justice. It is heavily relying on the findings which have been established by the monitoring missions which are operating on the territory of Ukraine, the official documents of the General Assembly or other international institutions, since the formulations they are using, they are like officially accepted within all the bodies which are operating within the framework of the United Nations.
And actually, what's your opinion on the international reaction to the Kerch Strait incident? Because actually, you had the US, you had the European Union talking about this. It was on the front pages of actually quite a few newspapers. It was a story that really put Ukraine back in the spotlight again. So what's your judgment about the reaction? Do you think it was too little or not?
I guess that this time we got not such a powerful response from the international community, although the expectations from the Ukraine were pretty high.
What would you expect or hope for, perhaps?
I would suggest to take into account more risk assessment on the side of Ukraine. In these terms, I mean that we should be aware that there is an ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russian Federation. And this conflict relates not only to the territory of Crimea, but also to the maritime. And this is very important. Of course, if we take into account the recent statement from Turchynov, he said that Ukraine will do the same very soon. They will send other vessels, and I think that it is not very reasonable step, taking into account all the consequences we had so far.
We have about 2 or 3 minutes left of the interview. I'd like to ask your view about the sanctions, which you mentioned among the diplomatic and political means to actually influence the Kremlin and certain people surrounding Vladimir Putin. In Ukraine, you have quite a few ministries or government organizations which are involved in suggesting who should be sanctioned. We have the Cabinet of Ministers, National Security and Defence Council, the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories and IDPs. So they're all trying to sanction different people almost. So do you think that this is a very effective way of doing it? Do you think that the people who really should be targeted are being targeted?
Actually, the state policy of Ukraine in terms of sanctions is not a good one. Let's say it because the law on sanctions was adopted back in 2014, and from this time and on there were no changes, and this law has a number of flaws. For example, it doesn't have the systematic and holistic approach towards the state policy on targeted sanctions. There is no synchronization with the sanctions which have been imposed by the international community, and there is no monitoring of the implemented sanctions so far. So we have no general idea how well is this law implemented in practice.
Yeah, it must be difficult to measure as well, because there are other factors. For example, I don't know if there's a strategy of reciprocity where, for example, other sanctions might, other countries rather, sorry, might have sanctions on people, and Ukraine doesn't support those sanctions. So there's a crossover. I don't know if this works.
We have a number of initiatives which are aimed at improving this situation. In terms of the letter, I should outline a number of laws which suggest some amendments to this law on sanctions, and there have been recently launched committee hearings dedicated to this issue. But of course, the prospects of adopting such law, especially on the eve of the political campaign in Ukraine, are unclear. Alas.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming into our studio, and it was great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
That was Tsymbrivsky. He's the head of USAID Human Rights in Action program. Stay tuned for more.